And I'm going to get to the start slide. And I'll tell you when to hit go unless you already have.
We have.
Okay. So welcome everyone to December edition of Cell Society Seminar. And our theme today is nutrition. And I'm really excited to be able to have Maire Folan from Vermont State Expanded Food Nutrition Educational Program Coordinator, EFNEP, here to join us to give a presentation on what is EFNEP anyway. And next up after that will be Dr. Jana Kraft, Associate Professor from the Department of Animal and Veterinary Sciences at UVM, speaking on dairy fat, not so bad after all. So many of you have been here before. Cell Society, really, the purpose is cross-pollination forum, really, to share research or education and extension across cows. And ideally out of that comes some stronger networks and maybe even some larger integrated, innovative grant proposals. So
Hans, are you meant to be sharing your screen right now? I don't believe you are.
Yes, I guess I am, and I'll quit out of this and just do that. Thank you for piping up. I won't go back to the beginning, but just so everyone can see that, I'm assuming. So the Cell Society seminars are really 2 in a row, monthly, and we're really on that second theme right now in December, and that's the nutrition theme. And next in January, we're doing an out-of-the-box brainstorming session where we'll look at some of the emerging themes that have come out of some of these presentations. So with that, I'm stopping my share, and I will turn it over first to Maire to look at what is EFNEP anyway. So welcome, Maire.
Great, thanks, Hans. I want to make sure everyone can see my slides. You seeing that?
Yep.
Great, okay, thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Maire Folan, the State EFNEP Coordinator with Extension's Community Nutrition Education Program, and I'm here to tell you more about what EFNEP is. So for those who don't know, EFNEP stands for the Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program, our nation's very first nutrition ed plan. It was created in 1969. It is a federal extension program and operates in all U.S. states and 6 of the territories. It's funded through USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and it utilizes the paraprofessional model. And for those who don't know what that means, it's where educators are coming directly from the community that they're serving. And the focus is on whole family health with EFNEP. And we use the term expanded to reflect its intention to build upon other federal programs like WIC or SNAP to provide additional nutrition and health education. And so EFNEP provides information around 4 core areas: diet quality and physical activity, food resource management, i.e. selecting healthy foods through cost-effective shopping, food safety, and food security. And so what that means for our participants is that they're learning skills like this and more. And so EFNEP offers, it is offered to a really particular audience, namely families with limited resources. So for adults, our focus is on those who are or will be parents. That includes pregnant moms, caregivers of children, young adults who may not yet be parents, and it also includes kinship care, where children are being cared for by grandparents or maybe other relatives. And we also do work with youth in the K-12 system. But we specifically serve limited resourced families and individuals, meaning they're at or below 185% of the federal poverty level. So for a family of 4 in 2022, they make a little over $51,000 or less a year. And they're likely also participating in other public assistance programs. So we offer classes for adults, young adults, and youth in 3 different ways. For adults, we can provide education in someone's home through a home visit. We can also do it in a small group at a community setting, or we can do it in a virtual setting. And we work really closely with social service organizations for adult recruitment like family resource centers, rehab services, housing trust, health clinics, community action agencies, and then some more familiar ones like WIC or maybe Reach Up. For youth, we work with schools to deliver lessons in class, in after-school programming, or virtually. And it's really, really important to know that we only offer classes as a series of lessons because it takes time to impact behavior change and set goals. We work with participants over a minimum of 6 times, and our lessons include hands-on components like cooking together. Class information can also be tailored to the individual or to the whole group need. So if somebody wants to learn more about, say, budgeting, there's definitely flexibility to weave that into class time. But this time expectation can make recruitment and retention for our adult classes really challenging. And we offer incentives like measuring cups or a chef's knife upon completion as a way to help keep people engaged and keep them coming back class after class. And this also ties back into our federal reporting. We have to report on the number of participants who graduate from our program, which includes the number of hours that they've attended, the number of lessons they've learned. And so here are some participation numbers for our state in the last few years. It's certainly not a good representative sample through the pandemic, but it gives you a sense of how many folks were reaching pre-pandemic in 2019. And like many other community organizations that work with the public, it is a very slow climb out of the pandemic. So many social structures have changed really significantly, and there's a lot of new employees and a lot of community organizations and in the schools that we work in. So now we find ourselves building up existing partnerships from scratch. So as you can also see from our numbers, it's so much easier to serve youth who are a captive audience in classes than it is adults, and recruitment for adult classes is super challenging. Across the country, EFNEP reaches roughly 500,000 low-income adults and families each year and has real impacts on the health and financial security of the participants, which in turn has a huge impact on our national healthcare system and costs. For instance, a fact that not many know is that EFNEP is the most effective federal nutrition program for increasing fruit and vegetable consumption. And indeed, our team of educators often hear from participants how this program positively impacts their lives. Topics like how to buy healthy foods on a budget, learning how much sugar is actually in everyday foods, or how to read food labels can help equip our participants with knowledge and empowerment to make healthy decisions that works the best for them and their families. And we also have data to show how we're improving the health outcomes of participants. Our program gathers a lot of data to help us assess where participants are at with various health measures when they come in to see us, and then how they're doing after our intervention. So this graphic here is from FY22, showing upon entry to our course, only 57% of adults were meeting the recommendation for dark green vegetable consumption each week. But after the course, 82% were meeting the recommendation. And we're often told how great this program is, but why don't we work with X particular population or maybe a certain partner in the community? And EFNEP is a great program, it really is, but it's very specific and limiting in who we work with and how. So adult participants must be parenting, which eliminates a huge group of low-income adults who could benefit from the program. And we don't offer one-time events. This is a time commitment to complete our course. And then there's the logistics of getting a group class off the ground, finding a central location that's easy to get to, has adequate meeting space, and has kitchen facilities, and we can use it for free. And also determining eligibility for EFNEP requires intrusive, copious amounts of paperwork, which can be burdensome for participants. We complete a 24-hour dietary recall at the beginning and the end of our course. And if actually you'd like to see what that process looks and feels like, I'll put a link in the chat at the end for an online version of this tool if you'd like to try it out. And I think you're going to find it actually more challenging than you think. So I tell you all that not to turn you off, but rather to give you the information to help determine if a partnership or a referral would be fruitful. And we really greatly rely on referrals and partnerships to make classes happen. So if you know someone who meets our eligibility and could benefit, you can call us, email, or have them sign up online. And it would be even better if you want to help us host a group class. And this is best served if you have an existing group that you're working with that we can just plug right into. And do know that we will need assistance finding a space, and the classes are most successful when the community partner helps facilitate. So that would mean communicating with participants, reminding them of the class time and location, and encouraging them to sign up and keep attending. So knowing what you know now, perhaps there's a group, agency, or an individual we should connect with. Is there a research project we could assist in? Or maybe research information that would benefit our participants that you can share? I'm really interested in thinking more about how we can offer our classes to UVM students as well. And I see a lot of really creative ways that we can work with UVM faculty and staff. So all in all, I hope this gives you a better sense of what EFNEP is, how we work, and how you can help support this really super program. So if you have questions or follow-up, referrals, or maybe a group class idea, I'd love to hear from you. And I think there's going to definitely be time for questions as well. So I'll stop my screen share.
Oh, wow, Mara, that was great. That was actually like 11 minutes or whatever. That was an excellent overview, really clear, and thank you. And I wanted to tell people to definitely put questions in the chat as well. And given our time, often we'll save, have discussion, more general discussion time at the end, but we can definitely handle one or two sort of either informational questions or things for Mara right now about EFNEP. And if you do,
there's several questions in the chat. Maybe some of those could be addressed.
Yes. So why don't we, Leslie, since you have your hand up and we know you have to leave, why don't you ask a quick question there, and then we can look at a couple of the chat questions before we turn it over to Jana.
Okay, also I have something half typed in the chat, but I'll just stop. Excellent presentation, Maura. So I heard you say on the one hand that the program doesn't serve everybody because the participants must be their parents or so, but then you said, how can we offer classes to UVM students? So do you mean UVM students who are parents or?
Yeah, that's a great clarifying question, Leslie. I'm glad that you asked that. So for adults, they must be parenting. We can work with young adults who are not yet parents. So that's between the ages of 19 and 25. So that certainly does capture, the UVM student population.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. I'll think about that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So let me see if there's other questions in the chat.
Yeah, do you already work with AALV in Vermont?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what AALV stands for.
I was just getting the acronym as well.
It stands for Association of Africans Living in Vermont, although now they serve beyond the African community. So they serve the Asian immigrant, really any new American group.
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Margaret. That's a good question. I'm not sure if we've connected with them directly, and I can check in with Lori because I know in the South Burlington, Chittenden County area, she does do a lot of work with the immigrant population. I think to kind of get back to our eligibility, sometimes working with those larger groups who are kind of open to anyone within a certain demographic, because we're really limited to low income and low resourced families. Sometimes that can present a challenge of how do we reach just those folks within an organization, but that can definitely be something that we take a look at. So thanks for that tip.
Excellent. I put one question. Are there, it seems like it's such a cool program in that it's standardized and focused on a certain group and, working over time to implement that. And that's also in some ways a really great platform for research and impact. And you're doing a lot of research within EFNEP. And the question I have is, are there things that come up that you think would be really important to measure in potential impacts, but you really don't have the resources within the program to do that? Do you see what I'm saying? Like sort of like a wish list.
Yeah, that's a great question, Hans. We do ask, and we can ask a lot of questions with our questionnaires and paperwork. I mean, we have to be mindful of that burden on participants, like I mentioned. But I guess I see some opportunities with food systems work of really understanding what are folks buying, what are the choices and decisions that they're making when they go to the grocery store or wherever they shop and procure food, and how does that impact Vermont as a state, and how does it impact our agriculture and our economics? So that's kind of an area that I'm really interested in, and trying to also be mindful of that reporting burden on the backs of our low resourced community members. So definitely an opportunity to explore and to grow into, I think.
Thanks. And Margaret wrote at the end that ALLB, I think many of the youth and adults they serve would qualify. So it may be the
Awesome.
kind of thing it could be run within within their program to extend outreach.
Great. Thanks for that, Margaret.
Okay, well, why don't we, there were a couple other questions. We can get back to stuff. So why don't we, just without further ado, let's move on to looking at dairy fat specifically. And again, I'm very happy to have Jana Kraft here. We've been in touch for a while, actually. There was, I think probably a year ago, Jana was maybe going to give a presentation, but there was a segment of her research that had not been carried out yet. And I think some of that has been done now, and she's in a different place, and really excited to hear what you found and where things are.
That's indeed true. 1 year, actually. One question, I hate this question, but can you see my screen actually? If I pull this down, it shows the frame, but it actually says sharing has paused. So I'm not sure what's happening.
We can see it.
You can see it? Perfect. Okay. Well, first of all, Hans, thanks for inviting me, and thank you for challenging me to put all my research in 20 minutes. This has been indeed a challenge, and I hope I tackled that. So I called my presentation Dairy Fat Not So Bad After All, and it's not a secret. I'm a big proponent and fan of dairy fat, and that's what my research is all about. It's about dairy fat, and it focuses specifically on type 2 diabetes prevention. This is just rooted actually on our personal story. My father actually had type 2 diabetes, and he passed away prematurely of type 2 diabetes, which I have now made to one of my focuses in life, trying to actually prevent type 2 diabetes, and specifically actually hopefully with diet and not actually with medicine. And the last part of my presentation will be results from 2 different clinical trials. We did 2 different trials, one in young healthy adults, and the second one is actually in adults with prediabetes. So I want to get straight into the dairy fat. 1 serving or 1 glass of whole milk contains about 8 grams of fat in total. And what you can see here is that the predominant fatty acid class in dairy fat are saturated fatty acids, making up about 70% of the total fatty acids. That is followed by monounsaturated fatty acids with 25%. And there's only a very small amount of polyunsaturated fatty acids in milk fat, making up about 5%. And it's because, dairy fat is so high in saturated fatty acids that a lot of major dietary guidelines actually recommending low-fat and fat-free dairy products. And here I'm just giving you 2 different examples. On the left side, you see the dietary guidelines for Americans. On the right side, you see the dietary guidelines for the American Heart Association. And what you can see is that overall, both of them are recommending 2 to 3 servings or cups for the dietary guidelines for Americans of dairy products. But what you can also see is that they're recommending to choose from fat-free and low-fat milk as opposed to whole dairy, which, you know, most people actually don't know. Whole milk and whole yogurt is actually 3.25%, at least in the United States, and in 49 states. California is actually the only one that is having 3.5% as whole. And the reason why this recommendation stands is because the goal is to limit the intake of saturated fatty acids. And this is rooted in that saturated fatty acid has been associated with higher levels of blood lipids, specifically total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, but also triglycerides. And these, you know, have been associated with a coronary heart disease risk. So that's kind of rooted almost like 50 to 60 years ago with the Diet Heart Association hypothesis actually put forward by Ansel Keys. So this is relatively old, and in my humble opinion, this is a little bit a reductionist approach, because dairy fat is actually much more than saturated fatty acids. In fact, it's actually the most complex fat mixture of all edible fats we have in our diets. It's actually composed of more than 400 fatty acids. And just to give you a comparison, so while, you know, milk has 400 fatty acids, or a little bit more even, olive oil, for example, contains just about like 15 different fatty acids, and canola oil and sunflower oil contains about 20 different fatty acids. So that kind of puts it in perspective how complex dairy fat is. And what you see down here in yellow, this is a so-called chromatogram. This is basically the output of an analysis, and it gives you just a small snapshot. Each of these peaks are actually defined by a fatty acid. The bigger the peak, the bigger the fatty acid, or the greater the amount of the fatty acid in milk. So besides that, milk dairy fat is actually very complex. It also actually contains a lot of unique bioactive fatty acids. And they're unique because they're actually coming from the rumen of the cow. So the rumen of the cow is a home to a very diverse, very complex community of microbes. There are billions of microbes, as you know: bacteria, protozoa, archaea, fungi, and phages. And they live in a sort of symbiotic relationship with the cow, and specifically bacteria and protozoa. They are making up the majority of those microbes. They basically digest otherwise indigestible plant matter for the cow, providing the cow with nutrients, but also energy. And during this process of digestion, bacteria and protozoa also produce a lot of these bioactive fatty acids. And here to the right, you see a small short list of these. There are short-chain fatty acids. Butyric acid is one of them. There are odd-chain fatty acids. There are branched-chain fatty acids. Branched-chain fatty acids are a little bit my pet fatty acid group, if you will, but there are many more. And these fatty acids are basically also transported into the milk, because bacteria protozoa are escaping the rumen. They're being digested in the duodenum. Then the fatty acids are basically transported to the mammary gland, and thereby making it into the milk. And not just actually into the milk, they also actually make it into the meat. So ruminant meat also contains these unique bioactive fatty acids. And what's interesting about these is that they confer a lot of different beneficial biological effects with respect to health. There are many in vitro studies out there. There are also many studies in animals like rodents. And now we're actually getting also into the human research. And in fact, most recent epidemiological research has been suggesting that there are many health benefits of dairy fat. And specifically here, it has been shown in some observational studies that full-fat dairy may be actually protective against type 2 diabetes. And what I'm showing here, these are just snapshots of a few very recent publications. thus far, there's very little out on randomized controlled trials, and this is where I come in. Before I move into this, I just want to talk a little bit about type 2 diabetes, so we are all on the same page. So I want to just define what type 2 diabetes is. It's a chronic metabolic disorder, and it's characterized by high levels of blood glucose. And these come about because the body is not able to use insulin effectively, and or the pancreas does not produce enough insulin. And to explain this just a little bit more, it's likely the first what's happening, the insulin resistance. So your pancreas is actually producing insulin just in response to the glucose in your blood that comes from the food you're eating. The problem is that actually the cells can actually not effectively absorb the glucose into the cell. So that sends back the signal to the pancreas, well, you're not making enough. So the pancreas is actually trying to make even more, but this is actually not helping. And in fact, it's in the end almost like a light bulb because your pancreas is trying to produce, but it's basically not producing in the end anything anymore because it's extenuating its capacity. So what happens here is now you have a really high level of glucose in your blood, and that causes actually two problems. First of all, the first problem is glucose is energy, and it has to go into your cells to actually, so they can use the energy. If there's no energy, they cannot function properly. The second, and likely or even the bigger problem, is that the high amount of glucose in your blood is actually damaging to your nerves, to your blood vessels, and that causes often a lot of different health problems. Think about like a stroke, coronary heart disease. It can cause kidney disease, vision impairment, or premature death. So how do you know if you have diabetes? If you get a fasting blood glucose workup done and your numbers come back between 70 and 100 milligrams per deciliter, then this is considered normal. If your values are higher than the normal ones, between 100 and 125 milligrams per deciliter, then you're considered to have prediabetes, and this is right below their diagnostic threshold, which is at or greater than 126 milligrams per deciliter. So that's when you're considered to have diabetes. So over the last 20 years, the prevalence of diabetes has actually tripled, and I would like to show you this in a very impressive way. So here I'm showing you a data map from their Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And what you see here is that it's divided into all the different states, and it shows the geographic spread of type 2 diabetes. So the darker the shade, the more cases of type 2 diabetes have been diagnosed. So this is in 2000. Moving on 10 years later, as you can see, the map is getting darker, but here we are in 2020, the map is significantly darker. And as of 2020, 34 million Americans have type 2 diabetes, and that is basically 1 in 10, so 10%. And beyond that, an additional 88 million Americans have actually prediabetes. And this is a huge problem. And overall, and just to put this together, more than 100 million US adults are now living with type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes. And I always like to show this actually as an iceberg, because, you know, here we have the top of the iceberg with type 2 diabetes. That's what we can see. And we can usually, people, you know, they have symptoms when they have type 2 diabetes. But the bigger problem, and usually the more dangerous problem, is actually prediabetes. You know, a lot of people, they don't know they have prediabetes. They don't have any symptoms, nothing hurts. And with 88 million, this is a huge problem, because if it's not taken care of, within like 5 to 10 years, people will develop type 2 diabetes. And beyond this, actually prediabetes is really rising. And also with type 2 diabetes, it's, I think I did the calculation once, it's every 19 seconds, somebody in the United States is being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. So this is a huge problem. However, the good news is that type 2 diabetes is largely preventable. Because in the majority of the cases, although there is some genetic heredity as well, but in the majority of the cases, type 2 diabetes is brought on by lifestyle factors. And it is technically as basic as, keeping your weight under control, eating a healthy and balanced diet, and being physically active. And eating a healthy and balanced diet brings in now the part of my research. I'm specifically interested in a healthy and balanced diet. And as you can see here, I have the little glass of milk. That's where my research comes in. So the overarching goal of my research is to improve our understanding of the role of dairy fat in health as part of a balanced diet. And in order to attain this goal, we conducted two different studies, two different clinical trials, where the goal was to determine if substituting full-fat yogurt for fat-free yogurt would positively affect blood glucose control and thereby reduce the risk for type 2 diabetes. So this goes back to the observational studies I showed earlier, where there has been evidence based on their research that full-fat dairy might actually be protective against type 2 diabetes. But as we all know, observational studies are only providing us with associations, but not with a causal effect. So to move this forward, we conducted two different studies. And I'm going to show you first our study we did about like 5 years ago. That is in healthy male and female adults. We had 21 of those. The mean age was 27 years. So most of their volunteers we recruited on campus. There was undergraduate students, graduate students, and postdocs. They all had a normal BMI of 22. And we conducted a randomized double-blind crossover trial with two controlled experimental diet periods with 3 servings of either non-fat yogurt or full-fat yogurt. And how you can envision that is so first of all, this was double-blind, meaning that our volunteer didn't know whether they ate the non-fat yogurt and full-fat yogurt. And you might actually wonder how we got to do that. But we actually received the yogurt from Stonyfield, and they do an amazing job actually with their non-fat yogurt. It's so creamy that you technically cannot tell whether you're eating a non-fat yogurt or a full-fat yogurt. And besides the volunteer being not knowing what they're eating, me as the PI, I didn't know either what our volunteers received. Of course, our personnel who prepared all the diets, they knew what they were preparing, of course. So this was a crossover trial, meaning that the people were randomized in a certain sequence. Either they received first a controlled diet for 3 weeks that contained 3 servings of non-fat yogurt, and then crossed over into a controlled diet with 3 servings of full-fat yogurt, or vice versa. If they started with a full-fat yogurt, they crossed over into a diet with non-fat yogurt. And a crossover trial, and especially if it's controlled, is considered one of the gold standards in nutrition science because each person also serves as their own control. In total, the entire study was 8 weeks long, 56 days. So there was 1 week at the very beginning, we call this their run-in period, where they also received a controlled diet, but that was more like based on an American diet. And then they either received a controlled diet with the non-fat yogurt or with the full-fat yogurt. Each of these were 3 weeks. And after the first 3-week period, there was another washout period of 1 week. In terms of outcome measures, we measured blood glucose and insulin. We conducted a specific test. It's called the intravenous glucose tolerance test. That's as well a gold standard in diabetes research. We also calculated related indices from that. And we also analyzed the gut microbiota as our secondary outcome. That's basically an explanatory outcome measure. I'm specifically interested in the microbiota because in the last 10 to 15 years, more and more research has come out showing that diet impacts our gut microbiota, and thereby by shifting gut microbiota, we are also shifting their metabolites, which are basically absorbed into our body, and these molecules have an impact on our metabolism. And there's strong research that has shown there is this so-called called gut pancreas axis, where it's believed that the microbiota impacting the pancreas and the insulin production, but also like overall the whole body insulin sensitivity and resistance. So I've been very interested in this as well. So in terms of our findings, so we found that the consumption of dairy fat improved the glucose effectiveness and acute insulin response, which you can see here in these two figures. And glucose effectiveness and acute insulin response, they're basically kind of mechanisms that your body has to maintain glucose blood glucose level. And I always give my students the analogy that this is like almost like the engine of your car. So your engine of your car has a really tight temperature control. There's a control system which makes sure that the engine is not getting too hot, because then your car breaks down, or it's not too cold, because then your car wouldn't run either. So this is very similar with the glucose effectiveness and the acute insulin response. They basically, these are these two kind of mechanisms, beyond some other ones, that kind of maintain your blood glucose levels in a very narrow range. And what you can see here very nicely is, let me back up. Actually, people who have type 2 diabetes have a low glucose effectiveness and have also a low acute insulin response. So you want to see actually these two parameters up. And what you can see nicely here is that when our volunteers consumed the diet with the dairy fat, then their glucose effectiveness and insulin response was improved, and specifically in men, as you can see here, which I found very interesting. There was no difference, however, in our females. However, when you look to the figure to the right, here you can see that consumption of dairy fat, here again in yellow, that actually improved the fasting blood glucose, meaning that the blood glucose was lower when our volunteers consumed the dairy fat as opposed to the dairy fat-free diet. Here, on the other hand, very interestingly, we didn't see this effect in males, but we saw this effect in females. So clearly there's a sex-specific manner. Then we actually looked into the gut microbiota, and one very simple ratio, what a lot of researchers use, is the Firmicutes to Bacteroidetes ratio. And usually this ratio is high when you have some kind of metabolic dysbiosis, or when you have a microbial dysbiosis. And what we showed here is that when our volunteers ate the dairy fat diet, then actually this ratio was lower in comparison to when they ate the diet without the dairy fat. Interestingly, we saw this again only in the males and not in the females. So that actually begs the question if there is this connection between the gut microbiota and the glucose effectiveness and insulin response. So very interesting result. Next, we conducted a study in male and female adults who are pre-diabetic. The mean age was 59 years and their mean BMI was 30. As you can see, the number is very small, and I think I can honestly say this is the hardest study I've ever done in my life, because this was actually performed during the pandemic. Not only that we were shut down for over a year due to the pandemic, then there was the cyber attack where we were shut down. And then we had many volunteers who wanted to volunteer, but when they learned that our study is being conducted at the clinical research center and the medical center, they would not want to come to the medical center just due to sheer anxiety to come to a hospital. Also, another problem was that during the time of COVID, most people only did telehealth, so they actually didn't even know whether they had prediabetes or not. So it was just very, very hard to find people. So hence this number is much smaller as we wanted to. The study design was exactly the same. Here we did slightly different tests. We did an oral glucose tolerance test. We did a meal tolerance test. We looked into also other parameters, biomarkers such as fructosamine. I will explain this in a second. We also looked here now because we had a pre-diabetic population. We looked into the blood lipids, but also gut microbiota. We looked into gut hormones and inflammatory markers. This is, however, we just recently finished that. So I will only provide you with data on the blood glucose and fructosamine and blood lipids. We don't have all the data on the gut microbiota and inflammatory markers yet. So in terms of our findings, so what we found is that when our cohort would eat a diet with the dairy fat, then the fructosamine concentrations were decreased, which you can see in the first figure. And what this means is that usually when you go to the doctor, they will give you your hemoglobin A1C, which is kind of a marker of how your average blood glucose was over the last 3 months, because this is actually based on your erythrocytes, which live no longer than about 120 days. But because this is a kind of a short-term study, we had to use a different marker because the hemoglobin A1C doesn't work for that. So fructosamine is actually a perfect marker for short-term blood glucose changes, because it gives you kind of an idea of the average blood glucose of the last 2 to 3 weeks. So that was perfect. And as you can see here clearly that these fructosamine concentrations were lower, which is something you're actually interested in. The only thing is, and that was also very interesting, is we only saw this in females, but not in males. Another very interesting result was that the fasting blood glucose was lower. Why these numbers seem, very, or the difference seem not very big, but I just want to remind you that any blood glucose over 100 milligrams per deciliter is considered prediabetes, and everything below is considered normal. So basically, at least we were able to move the needle from prediabetes to normal just in a very, very short time. Also, what we saw is that the fasting insulin was lower. And from these two parameters, we were actually able to calculate the so-called homeostatic model assessment for insulin resistance. What this actually means is this kind of value gives you an idea of how insulin resistant or how insulin sensitive your body is. So people who have type 2 diabetes have a really high value of the HOMA-IR, whereas a person who is sensitive to insulin, meaning also then the glucose is getting into your cells, they actually have very low values. And what you can see here is on the right side, when our volunteers received the diet with the dairy fat, the HOMA-IR was lower. Not in men, but actually in women, meaning that women became much more sensitive to insulin, which is a really nice outcome. And secondly, and surprisingly, we also looked into blood lipids. And here we found that the blood triglyceride concentration was decreased in our, again, female volunteers. I'm sorry about that. By actually 10%. This was not, unfortunately, found in males. You can see there is a numerical difference, but there was no statistical difference. This was somewhat surprising because just as a reminder, when I told you that the dietary recommendations actually want you to limit your saturated fatty acid intake because it's considered raising your blood lipids. So here we actually showed, at least on short term, that your blood triglyceride concentrations are actually lowered. So dairy fat, in this case, improved your lipid homeostasis. So to put this all together, what we have shown is that short-term consumption, so just about like 3 weeks of 3 daily servings of full-fat yogurt, elicits beneficial effects on metabolic health. It enhances your glucose homeostasis. It enhanced lipid homeostasis. It altered the gut microbiota pattern, and the mechanism may be actually sex dependent, which I found really interesting. So to bring this full circle, while this is, of course, these are like 2 smaller studies, one is truly a pilot study, but they still kind of provide further support and evidence that actually one must consider the food matrix over actually just a nutrient like saturated fatty acids. And also, I feel like that at least I kind of provided 2 small puzzle pieces to the bigger puzzle, indicating that, yeah, I think we can actually move on or away from recommending fat-free and low-fat dairy products, because at least based on our preliminary data, there is no evidence that these that dairy fat actually increases any risk. I would like to just briefly end with an acknowledgement of my research team. It's a huge collective effort. While in the end, we are just ending up with small figures and tables. As you can see, the team is really large. I have several co-investigators and collaborator. I had a clinical project coordinator. I currently have a PhD student working on a study. I had study support. We have people working for us in a kitchen. In fact, the controlled diet is prepared in the kitchen like you would work in a lab after recipes, because everybody gets a very controlled diet. The major support we are actually getting from our clinical research center, from our nurses. They're taking care of our volunteers on a daily basis, because all of the volunteers had to come in on a daily basis except for the weekend. And I attribute a lot of success of the studies to them. And while we had only smaller numbers of volunteers, we actually had for both studies only 1 person dropping out, and the typical dropout rate is 20%. So I'm very proud of my team, and I could have never pulled this off without them. And with that one, thank you, and I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you so much, Jana. That was a fascinating and in-depth presentation. So I had billions of questions, which I limited myself to a few in the chat, but others do as well, I am sure. So yeah, let's open it up. We have, a little over 10 minutes before the hour, so we have a chance to talk about some of this stuff and potentially as well table some interesting topic ideas for a future brainstorming discussion, perhaps. Okay, so let's see. Leslie, I'm going to turn it over to you again because you got your hand raised, and I don't know when you're going to have to leave. And then
well, I'm supposed to be gone now, but this is so fascinating. Yeah. I couldn't leave. Oh my gosh, this was wonderful, Jana. Yeah, I'll just limit myself to a couple of, hopefully they're quick questions. So I think full fat probably does a good job of making you less hungry to eat other foods throughout the day. And so one question is it that people were less hungry throughout the day and therefore consume less because of the full fat? And was that looked at?
Yeah, so
or is it something in that magic full fat mix of 400 different?
I actually believe it's the latter. So one thing I haven't explained, and I can actually take an hour just to explain the whole study design. This was a truly controlled study. So everybody got a diet that was tailored to their needs. So they had to go through diet records, and so we actually know how much they're eating. So let's assume they're eating 2,000 kilocalories or need 2,000 kilocalories. So we would provide them with a 2,000 kilocalorie diet that was tailored to their needs. So all of them, they basically got the same kind of caloric content to their needs. So, and the goal for that was that because we wanted to make sure that they are not gaining weight, but they're also not losing weight, because if either is happening, then we can attribute, of course, our, results to either of those. The only thing is that, of course, we did have sometimes that people would more lose than actually gain weight. So we had to actually adjust. And that's where our bionutritionists are coming in. One question you might have is like, oh, well, did they all eat what they are supposed to eat? I hope so. So what we did is they certainly all had to come in for one meal. So they all had to eat actually their breakfast in our facility. So at least for one meal per day, we knew that they were eating it. And then they had to bring in back all of their containers. They had oodles of containers to bring back next day, which were inspected. And so overall, I feel good about what they ate. And what I haven't shown, though, is, and that's the beauty about doing research on fats, we actually also looked at their blood fatty acids, and they reflected what they ate. So I do feel good about their compliance, but I cannot rule out that some of them popped in a piece of chocolate.
Yeah. One other just thought. So from my background in both cardiovascular disease and cancer research is that it is amazing how the findings, at least in meetings I've attended where anything about diet has been discussed, at a cardiovascular meeting and a cancer meeting seem to almost be parallel. Like they're saying the same things, like eat healthy and exercise. And so I'm on the board for our cancer center here, and I know there's a lot of research that's going into the cancer center, and I bet your findings may have implications in the cancer world as well. Just putting it out there. So I'm going to lower my hand, and I may have to jump off here, but super fascinating.
Thanks for all your questions, and thank you for actually attending. Once I saw you on the screen, it's like, oh my goodness, now the bar is higher.
So thank you, Leslie. And let's see, Claire and Mara both had questions in the chat, and maybe I'll just invite you. I can read them, but Claire, if you're there and want to unmute or have your video come up, and Mara as well. If not, I can read the questions.
Yeah, I had asked my question early on, so you're sort of addressed this, but when you were presenting all the benefits of dairy fat, I was curious about which of those translated to fermented dairy products, like yogurt and cheese, selfishly as someone who can't digest fluid milk.
Yeah, so in our case, we actually, performed that with yogurt. So we had, which is a fermented product. And in this case, of course, the comparison was, fermented product with fat, without fat. I do believe strongly, and we are just currently actually working on a review paper on the impact of the food matrix on and dairy fat. And what we can see over and over is that fermented products certainly seem to fare better. Be it yogurt and be it actually cheese. Cheese would be a really interesting one too. The only thing is like where to start, right? Because there are like 2,000 different cheeses. They're soft ripened, hard ripened, so it's kind of hard to start there. But again, there has been a lot of research now showing that this kind of matrix seem to have like positive impacts. And I can add, butter not always fares as good, but this is only what I have seen in observational studies, which I found tricky to kind of translate the science. And that would be actually another research I would be very interested in conducting, looking closer into, like that. One important thing is I also wanted to mention is the fat in butter is different than the fat actually in yogurt and in cheese. And what I mean with this is in butter, it's basically water and oil, and in yogurt and cheese, it's the opposite. So I've always wondered if that actually has an impact on, the effects as well. I don't know, but the cool thing is that's something worthwhile to research. I just don't know how to do a double-blind study with butter. That's a little trickier.
Yeah, and you can definitely tell the difference between low-fat cheese as well. That's
Yes,
not
exactly.
pleasant.
Great. Well, thank you for that question, Claire. And we're getting close to time, but Mara, I know you had a few questions in there, so why don't you summarize what you want? And I also had one quick one, and I definitely think this could be right for another session in January, just exploring some of these resource options.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
Mara.
thanks, Hans. I'll be quick. Actually, I have another question outside of the ones I already asked, but I found it was so fascinating. There were differences between gender, and I'm wondering, Jana, if you have a sense of why that was, or maybe what are some next steps to investigate that more?
Yeah, I personally found this is the most interesting part of the study, that we found so striking differences. And I always say to my students, actually, that likely in 50 years, and I'm not on this planet likely either anymore, unless I have the H genes, but I really think that based on if you're male or female, based on your genetic background, you're gonna have a diet that is tailored to that, to actually, enhance or, make sure that your metabolism is, at a high level. I have an idea about the sex differences. So for the young cohort, females are protected with the estrogen. So you barely see anything then, because it protects us. Whereas, like our male counterparts, they don't have that protective one, which is why I think you actually see striking differences. With the older population, our estrogen is going away and it's not protecting us anymore. But where I think what happens now is that if we do eat a diet, and in this case, it was just dairy fat, it could be something else, that it's possible that in females, it works better and more effective because there's this protective effect gone. That's all what I can explain right now. In fact, I have gotten this question and I found this interesting. It was actually in my honors college class. A student asked, what about transgender? They were asking me, it was like, what if somebody is actually going through, a change in hormone therapy? And it's like, that is an amazing question. And I don't know the answer. And it's just, there's so much to research.
Thanks, Maura.
Thanks, yeah.
You want to hold, do you have another question, or Scott had also piped up and it looks like was saying he's too curious about the question I had, which is like grass milk being in the whole fat grass milk being in the grocery store at about a 20%, 30% price increase over organic regular milk. Is there any research that you know of? I mean, this is really relevant to UVM and Vermont because we have so many hill farms and so much good grass grazing dairy land, but not flat dairy land. So question about that, if you know of anything or if there's potential future study there.
There is not, and it's funny you're asking because you should ask Heather. I've been knocking on Heather's door for quite a while now because I would love to do a study with milk from grass-fed animals, because when you actually look at that profile, it's a much better profile with more of these bioactive fatty acids because there are on grass and there's more fiber, more forage, more secondary compounds that actually enhance the lipid metabolism of the microbiota. So organic milk is good too, but we have learned that the management sometimes not necessarily translate into an improved fatty acid profile. There is when they're on pasture, but if you have like an organically managed cow, let's say not in the United States where they have to be out for 120 days, if they're just indoors, they're actually no better than actually in the conventionally fed cow on the basis of the fatty acids. But yes, to answer your question, I think the grass-fed, idea would be amazing.
Great. Well, maybe we can table this question and maybe some others like it for a January brainstorming session. And we are out of time. So I really want to thank you, Maura, and everyone else who showed up. And again, these are scheduled every month, usually in the second Thursday, but it can vary. And lo and behold, we've gotten through an entire year. This was our last session in 2022, and we're looking ahead. We've got a draft schedule up for the coming year, and we hope if you have any ideas or things you would like to cover, we'll put out what we think is good, but a lot of up in the air stuff for especially the out of the box sessions. So please look us up online at Cells to Society seminar at ubm.edu. And I look forward to any comments, and again, thanking our guests, and we're going to end things for today. Thank you very much and have a good rest of your day.